had to endure in his relationship with Hashem, with the Lord. When we hear the blast of the shofar, as I told you last night, one of the things the shofar blast is to remind us of is the ram's horn that was caught in a thicket and Abraham was able to use to replace Isaac instead of the sacrifice. In this way, the Akedah represents the truth of the Besorah, the good news of Yeshua, in how God's attribute of mercy overcomes his attribute of justice. So the story of the offering of Isaac, Abraham's promised seed, begins with a statement, after these things, God tested Abraham. After these things grammatically connects the Akedah with what came before. What came before was the expulsion of Abraham's son Ishmael. And you know that story. Sarah realized that her son Ishmael, even though he was the oldest son, was causing a lot of problems for the promise of God to Abraham to be fulfilled. He was trying to actually destroy, in some way, Isaac's blessing. That came before the Akedah. What were the tests that Abraham had to endure? I'll just quickly run them down for you. There were 10, culminating with this test that we read about today. The first test was Abraham had to reject the religion of his father Terah, idolatry. Second, he had to leave his country for a foreign land. Third, he was tested with famine upon entering the promised land. He had to deal with some of the problems Sarah had with some of the kings in those days. Another test was fighting on behalf of his nephew Lot and fighting the 4 kings on behalf of Lot. He had to experience a dreadful vision of the future captivity. He had to undergo pain of circumcision at the ripe old age of 99. He had to endure the infertility of Sarah, despite the promise of an heir. And he also was responsible to evict his wife Hagar and her son Ishmael from the community. There's a lot of tests, and we think we have trouble.
Yeah.
And then the 10th test comes as we read about this morning. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, Hineni, here I am. This came after 30 years of silence. God hadn't spoken to Abraham for 30 years, but he finally called to the faithful Abraham. And he said these words, take your son, your only son, whom you love. There's the word ahava, love. Even Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Abraham replied with the one statement that committed him to God forever, Hineni, here I am. This is a word that we need to remember in our lives, because God is calling us always, day after day after day, to say Hineni to him. What is God asking you to do? What is he asking you to sacrifice? What is he asking you to exert yourself in? We need to say Hineni to those things. So go to the land of Moriah. The land of Moriah is in the promised land. And it was Moriah that was the place where tradition says God created the universe. And Adam and Eve were placed there. It's considered to be in Moriah. Moriah is said to be where God created Adam, and also Mount Moriah to be where Adam made the first sacrifice, as did his sons Cain and Abel. So Moriah in biblical history was a very key place in the geography of ancient Israel. It says that Abraham called the place Adonai Yireh, meaning God will see or God will provide. Subsequently, Moriah was renamed by combining two words to form the word Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. This place became called Mount Zion, the mountain of the Lord. It was a place of the future temple, and it was a place of the sacrifice of Yeshua himself. Now, some commentators claim that Abraham actually misunderstood God's commandment about his son. God, even though it says he called him to sacrifice his son, it was never God's intention for Abraham to really go through with it. The verb Allah, or oleh, means to ascend or to lift up. And in the Hebrew it says, God called Abraham to lift up his son. Now often when a sacrifice is made, it is lifted up on the altar. So that's why people interpret this to mean that God intended for Abraham to sacrifice his son Yitzhak. But that's not necessarily the case. The commentator Rashi says that when God said, with regard to the sacrifice of humans, Rashi says, God said he did not command that. He did not have that in mind. He had something else in mind, and that's what we want to take a look at this morning. But Abraham understood God's instruction to mean that Isaac was to be offered as a human sacrifice, as strange as that sounds to our ears today. An olah, a burnt offering. It was a cult practice among the pagans in that era. And these people were immersed in the idolatry of Molech, one of the many deities in the tribal world of Israel, of the ancient Near East. Some have speculated the test given to Abraham centered primarily on renouncing such pagan conceptions of God. The temptation to elevate blind obedience to an arbitrary deity above the dictates of compassion and conscience had to be overcome. See, it would have been very easy for Abraham to go ahead with this because it was a common practice in the Middle East, these kinds of sacrifices. I hate to tell you, it was not a sane world back in those days. People were pretty crazy, and literally children were sacrificed. But here Abraham has an opportunity, or God through Abraham has an opportunity to make a grand statement to the world in that era. Why didn't Abraham argue with God? You know, Abraham argued with God in other examples in the Bible. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, remember? Abraham debated with God and reasoned with him about the fact that maybe he didn't have to destroy the whole land if there's some righteous people in the land. So little by little, Abraham negotiated with God. Why didn't he negotiate with God here? Why didn't Abraham protest? Soren Kierkegaard, the great philosopher, said in a book he wrote called Fear and Trembling that Yirat Elohim, the fear of God, had taken people to sheer madness, and that Abraham was called to take a stand against this. So instead of arguing with God about the rightness of his request, Abraham immediately began preparing the sacrifice. He didn't question God's instructions, nor, as we know from the Rosh Hashana, nor did he doubt that God would be able to fulfill his promise that Isaac would be the descendant, the promised seed of the multitude of the people of Israel. So Abraham, it says, saddled his donkey first thing in the morning, indicating that he was going to be personally responsible for the mission that God called him to. There are countless commentaries on the Akedah and various theories about what this is all about. But one thing we know for sure, that the binding of Isaac was the 10th and final test our father Abraham had to pass in order for him to become the father of the Jewish people, the spiritual father of all the Christian people, and also the father of all the Arabs. Abraham was a great man, and he proved it with this test. Now, some people see a connection between this binding of Isaac and they call it the Ishmael connection. According to Rashi, the great Middle Ages commentator, the sacrifice of Isaac was actually to be a like-for-like kind of sacrifice. Because you remember, when Sarah, Abraham's wife, told her husband, you've got to get this woman, Hagar, and her son out of here. What did Abraham do? He loved Ishmael. Ishmael was his firstborn son. And he loved Hagar too. But Sarah said, no way, get him out. So Abraham, what did he do? He sent them out into the wilderness, where for sure they would die. Except God came to Hagar and provided a solution to the problem. So Hagar and Ishmael lived, and Ishmael became the father of the Arab nations. Now, I am not anti-Arab at all. I know that politically the Arabs are nothing but trouble for the Israelis. But not all Arabs. There are some Arab nations that are dedicated to destroy the Jewish people. They don't understand the Bible. They don't understand the calling of the Jewish people as the chosen people. And that's why they say, well, let's get the Jews out of the land and we'll take over. Except, whenever the Arabs take over a land, it goes downhill. I hate to tell you this. Things go downhill. And if you've been to some of the Arab villages in the Middle East, you don't see anything like you would see in the Israeli villages. Mostly they're slums. It's not that Arab people are innately dirty, but their cities have become pretty much slums. Moreover, very few, if any, Arab people have ever won Nobel Prizes. And yet, dozens and dozens and dozens of Israelis have won prizes. And we think that that makes the Arab people pretty jealous of the people that God called his chosen people. And that's sort of a theme in this whole story of the Akedah. Yet, God was going to have his way. So, Abraham, even though he was headed to the sacrifice, told his two servants that he would come back. Now, I don't know exactly what happened in Abraham's mind. How did he know that God would spare his son ultimately? I think he understood who God really was. And he was willing to go through with what God asked him to do. But in his back of his mind, he knew that God would not really bring this to pass. The New Testament comments on this and says that Abraham believed God would resurrect Isaac from the dead. Even if Abraham had to go through with the sacrifice, he believed that God would bring him back from the dead. Abraham believed in resurrection, so why not? That was how Abraham conceptualized this working. I don't know for sure he thought that God would stay his hand when he was going to stab his son with a knife. But somehow he knew that God would be fair, even though things looked bleak. It's clear that both Abraham and Isaac were willing to go through with this sacrifice. As painful as it sounded, as ridiculous to our ears as it sounds, they were willing to go through with the sacrifice because they understood it was a test. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. The ram was offered for Isaac, which is an idea of substitutionary atonement. In other words, the ram was a replacement for the person of Isaac. This concept of substitutionary atonement is very important for us to understand, because as Messianic people, we believe in substitutionary atonement. We believe that our sins need to be atoned for somehow, And the ancient system of atonement on Yom Kippur doesn't exist anymore because there's no temple. Without a temple, you can't make an atonement for sin. But the temple was destroyed after the death of the Messiah. So God provided for our atonement in the death of the Messiah. Yet the Talmud says, the Holy One, blessed be He, said, sound before me the ram's horn, so that I may remember on your behalf the binding of Isaac, and account it to you as if you had bound yourselves before me. So the rabbis of old saw in the Akedah the idea of substitutionary atonement. They believed, because of Abraham and Isaac's willingness to sacrifice, that this was a teaching that God wanted us to have, the idea of substitutionary atonement. So Abraham called this place Adonai Yireh, the Lord will provide. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. There's a tradition that Abraham actually went through with the act of sacrifice on Moriah. After all, the subsequent text shows Abraham returning alone from the mountain. It's a little confusing, so we have to really work on this to figure this out. But we need to remember the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant, clarifies it because it teaches us that even though Abraham was willing to go through the sacrifice, he trusted God with everything he had. He was willing to do what God asked, even though I'm sure in his heart of heart, he hoped it would not come to pass. This is the great message of the Akedah that we listen to on Rosh Hashana. Part of it is in preparation for Yom Kippur, which is 10 days from now. Part of it is preparation because on Yom Kippur, we have a tradition that God has opened the gates so we can interact with one another and seek forgiveness from one another. And on Yom Kippur, the gates are closed for another year. So with that in mind, we think about the picture of the Akedah, the fact that God was willing to put Abraham to the test so that Abraham would pass the test with flying colors as a lesson to us. We think it's a big test when we have to apologize to somebody. It's a big deal. Most people don't know how to apologize. Our pride gets in the way. And yet we offend people all the time. Well, the teaching of Rosh Hashana is that this is the time to begin making reconciliation, making repentance to the people that we have offended during the year. Can you think of anybody that you have offended? I'll give you a second. Think of it. Who have you offended in this past year that you really do need to make reconciliation with before Yom Kippur? You have 10 days, the Yomim Noraim, in which to do this. And it's pictured here in the fact that Abraham went through his 10 tests, and all God asks us to do is pass the test of doing what is right. If we've hurt somebody, if we've offended somebody, this is the time to get it squared away. So as a prelude to the coming up of Yom Kippur, the Akedah is a very significant story to be told on Rosh Hashana. Let's stand for Aleinu. And then, well, you know what?